Welcome to JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So friends, it is still the first month of the year and we're trying to give you stimulus for reading the Bible. I study it with you, of course, week in and week out, but Corie Hembree is with me all of this month to talk about her perspective on the scriptures as a veteran commentator on Discovery Television. It really is a great program and she's a tremendously gifted communicator. We'll get to her and the Bible study right after this.
JCT TV is the official voice of WOW, working for orphans and widows. Jim Cantelon is the founder of WOW and has been ministering to orphans and widows in distress for 18 years. WOW's focus is home-based care for the dying. The horizon is vast, with thousands of the least of these in Africa and India. WOW depends on your generous support. To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
Corie Hembree is my guest. The last two programs she's been on, she's on this show and also the next. We're talking about the Bible, and she has done what most of us have not done, and that is studied it intensely. This is the beginning of the new year, and a lot of you have resolved to read the Bible assiduously and with discipline. May it be so. Mm-hmm. But hopefully, Corie's input will help stimulate an interest maybe beyond just reading, but to actually studying and learning what's going on there. The last two programs, Corie, we've talked about the time of the kings. Mm-hmm. Let's shift to something else.
Sure.
The book of Psalms. Mm-hmm. Now it's varied. The general view out there is that David wrote the book of Psalms, when of course he wrote some of them.
He did write some of them.
But
a lot of them,
but he didn't write all of them.
Not all of them.
You got Asaph, you got the sons of Korah.
Yeah.
I think there's one or two in there by Moses.
There is, yeah. Maybe some from Solomon.
Maybe, and some of them are, anonymous, so yeah. we can only speculate.
Yeah.
What value do the Psalms add to the reader's life?
I think there's a few. I really think that there's something so interesting about being able to read music and poetry from the heart of an ancient person, because you see the differences in culture. I mean, a lot of us, especially in the Western world, we don't have to worry about physical enemies coming after us. We don't have to worry about warfare in the same way that you see it expressed in the Psalms. But in the worship sections towards God, it's like you're talking to your neighbor, yeah. So there's this intensely human element and this shared experience of worshiping God that I think is really, really, really awesome. So there's that whole element of it. But then there's the other element where, when you really want to understand a culture, you look at their poetry, you look at their music, you look at their art. And so you get to see how their understanding of God really impacted their lives and impacted, their everyday lives. These are songs that they're writing, not only for their worship, but they would have known them. They much like our worship songs today, we can sing them at home. We make them a part of who we are, and the lyrics represent what we believe about God. So I think that's a really interesting portion to be able to see at that moment in history, this time period of the kings from David and on, and even back into Moses. How did their understanding of God shape their everyday lives? And we get to see that in the book of Psalms.
David is an interesting psalm writer. I mean, he writes glorious psalms, none more glorious than Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Everybody knows that one. But he also writes what are called psalms of imprecation, imprecatory psalms, where he just wants God to nail his enemies.
Yes, he does.
And boy,
Yes,
he describes it in no uncertain terms. I mean, it's pretty raw reading.
It is very raw.
Yeah, and again, if someone is reading the Psalms for the first time, you'd understand that some of these came from David's conflicts.
Yeah.
With enemies, and he wanted God on his side, and he wanted God to destroy his enemies, and he just says it in no uncertain terms. Then you also have what's called Psalms of Ascent that they used to sing on the way up to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountain of its holiness, beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion. On the sides of the north, you can hear them singing this as they tromped up the hill and in Israel, when someone immigrates to Israel, they call it making aliyah, which means going up.
Yes.
Jerusalem is about almost 4,000 feet above sea level, and to get to Jerusalem, you have to go up. From Tel Aviv, you got to go up, up, up from the Judean wilderness, from down in Jericho. Man, it's a huge climb. But they would sing these psalms as they walked up the hill. It's absolutely fascinating. Then you have a few psalms, starting with Psalm 118. It's called the Great Hallel. The great blessing psalms that are recited every Passover in the Seder. Very, very rich. Do you have a favorite psalm?
I don't really have a favorite psalm. No. I mean, I have a soft spot for Psalm 22, of course, because Jesus quoted it from the cross, and it is extremely messianic. Also, Psalm 27. My dad had me memorize that when I was little, so that always has a close place to my heart.
It's interesting how the things we memorize when we were kids stick with us, huh?
Yeah.
I wish I had as absorbing a brain now as I had when I was 6
we
years
all?
old.
Yes, don't we all?
We then get into what's called the major prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. Fascinating men.
So interesting.
Yeah, Isaiah, unlike most prophets, probably was wealthy. He was probably a bit of a nobleman, a courtier. Probably drove a Porsche.
Yes, a very fancy donkey or
very
something.
Fancy donkey. But Isaiah penned some of the most powerful words of all time, not the least of it being Isaiah 53.
And his life spanned quite a few different kings as well. And he was right in a very interesting transitional time period. So, again, reading through, I think a lot of people have trouble with the prophets. I know that I used to have a lot of trouble with the prophets. Knowing the context of what is going on, because they jump time periods and everything like that. But one practice that I find really helpful when I'm reading through, for example, Isaiah, he talks about, right in Isaiah 1, talks about, I prophesied during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So then you can go back to Kings and Chronicles and read the accounts of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kind of figure out a little bit of what's going on. That kind of helps ground your understanding, though some of the visions, they're just interesting, and you can't really contextualize that too much. But I find them really, really interesting, and Isaiah especially, because he did span quite a few.
There's also
reigns.
a theory that there may have been two authors of the book of Isaiah. Second Isaiah. I'm not too sure what I think about that, but there is a certain stylistic shift, and it seems sometimes contextually, but we won't get into that. Jeremiah was not a very happy guy.
No, poor Jeremiah. It just, really, really unfortunate circumstance where he had a very negative message to the kings of his time period. And it would have been, I can imagine, as someone living in Jerusalem and Judah, it would have been quite offensive and really hard to digest the message of Jeremiah, because he's essentially saying, guys, it's over. Just politically, what they're seeing is, Jerusalem's just trying to survive. Judah's just trying to survive, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire is coming in. And so the king and all of the noblemen of Jerusalem are trying to, gird the hearts of all their people. No, we can do it. We're going to be fine.
Yeah.
God's going to keep us great. Everything's going to be great. They're trying to boost morale because they know they're going to have to fight a battle. And then here comes Jeremiah, and he's like, give up.
Yeah, like
Give up, guys.
Yeah, he's a wet blanket.
He's the wet blanket. Like, talk about getting rid of morale.
Yeah, in fact, they're so fed up with him at one point, they throw him into a pit.
Yeah.
Poor guy.
Poor guy, I know.
Had to haul him out of the mud by putting ropes under his arms. The weeping prophet.
The weeping
He
prophet.
also wrote Lamentations. Ezekiel's a little difficult to read.
Very.
He has all these visions and he's measuring things.
Yes. What's with that?
I'm thinking, what's up?
All these numbers. Come on.
I don't. It's important to me to know how many cubits this was, how many cubits that was, and what I find interesting about Ezekiel is prior to his most famous vision about the Valley of the Dry Bones, he talks about God speaking to Israel, saying, "I'm going to restore the land, and I'm not going to do it because you're such good people. I'm going to do it for the sake of my holy name."
Yes.
And it's in Ezekiel, more so than anywhere else, for me at least, I see the importance of the name. You know, in Israel, religious Jews still refer to God, not by the name God, but Hashem, which means the name. They call him the name. If they're writing God in letters, they write G-D. They don't even write. And Yahweh, they will not.
They won't say.
They won't pronounce it. They won't write it. Because to pronounce the name of God is to invoke his presence, and no one can live in his presence. Having said all of that, the importance that God attached to his name, his reputation, you know, the name that you, Israel, have disgraced among the nations. I'm going to restore the integrity of my name. And again, this goes back to the time when there still was this view of local deities.
Yeah.
And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh was being summarily dissed because the land was doing so poorly. I love that part of Ezekiel. What do you like about Ezekiel?
Well, just as you were saying that, you're right. I've never really thought about the intense mentions of God's name throughout Ezekiel, but you're right. And what that made me think of was, that's really interesting because Ezekiel is in exile in Babylon.
That's right.
And in Babylon, you know, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, he's taken a bunch of men into his court. Ezekiel's probably watching this, a bunch of people into his court, and he renames them. So at a time when everyone, the nation, all of the you know, the cream of the crop, men of Judah, they're losing their names and their names, you know, that invoke the power of God. They have, you know, God elements woven into their names. That's being stripped away, and pagan God names are being attached to, you know, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, all of that stuff. So that's really interesting that at that moment when all of those names are being stripped away, God is talking about how he is going to, for the sake of his name.
Well, his name was being stripped away. I've got a minute and a half. We have this 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament, this intertestamental period, the 400 years of silence. In your view, in your studies, was God silent, or was it just that the prophets weren't writing at that point in time?
I think that God was still moving. But I do think there was prophetic significance to a period of silence, and for, you know, John the Baptist being the one to break that silence. So I think it was meant to, probably a lot of things, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it was meant to shake. It was meant to shake up. But a lot of interesting things still happened in that intertestamental period.
Do you have a theory as to which of the Old Testament books was written last?
I don't actually, no.
Because I've sat in on debates and read a lot about it. Some think the Chronicles was the last book written. Some people, of course, say, well, no, it's just like the way it is there in the Bible. Just leave it the way it is. I don't think that really matters. But you mentioned John the Baptist. He was like the last of the Old Testament prophets.
Yes, even associated himself with Elijah by how he dressed and where he traveled in his ministry. So he was definitely associating himself with those Old Testament prophets.
Yeah, camel's hair. I got to tell you, in that temperatures there, especially down by the Jordan River, you don't want to be wearing camel's hair.
No.
I've sometimes wondered about his hygiene.
Yes. Couldn't have smelled the greatest.
Maybe he smelled more like a camel, but boy, he sure had a powerful message. And
He did.
And he was the forerunner, of course, of the Christ. We're going to have one more program with Corie Hembree, friends, and I know you'll want to be watching it. And if you've missed any of the last two programs previous to this one, JimCantelonToday.com, log on, find the show, listen to Corie. She's amazing. We'll take a little break, and when I'm back, I'll continue with our Bible study.
Jim Cantelon Today is a program dedicated to the teaching of the good news of Jesus Christ. This all through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. JCT also brings to you encouraging testimonies and stories from Christian leaders all over the globe. If this program has added value to your life, would you please consider becoming a partner? To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
So, we've been talking about some of the Sabbath controversies that Jesus encountered. The last couple of weeks, we've looked at a controversy over his disciples walking through wheat fields and pulling up heads of grain and rubbing it to get rid of the chaff and then eating the kernels. And then last time we looked at Jesus healing a man with a withered hand in the Capernaum synagogue. Now we pick it up in verse 7 of Mark chapter 3. Reading it here, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea. Now, I should just say here, the Sea of Galilee is not a sea. It's a lake. It's a small lake. By North American standards, it's a small lake. It's, to use the descriptive terms in most of the world, it's 12 kilometers long and about 6 kilometers wide. By North American standards, it's a puddle. It's fairly deep, has a lot of fish in it. It's fed by a number of water sources that come down from Mount Hermon. The Jordan River exits the Sea of Galilee, goes down to the Dead Sea, and it's been doing this for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's called the Sea of Galilee. The Israelis call it Kinneret, which means harp. It's harp-shaped. It's about 400 feet below sea level. Tiberias is on its west coast. Capernaum is on its north coast. The Golan Heights, as we know them now, are on the east coast, and then Jordan. And then on the south, the Jordan River leads down into what's called the Jordan Valley, all the way down. And I mean down, that's why it's called Jordan. Yarden means down rusher. It rushes down to the Dead Sea. Not much rushing going on these days, though, because the Israelis and the Jordanians, in sort of cooperative farming efforts, have tapped into much of the water that flows through the Jordan River for the purposes of irrigation. But it's still flowing. And when I lived there in Israel for those 7 years, I was able from time to time to baptize people in the Jordan River, baptize my own kids in the Jordan River. How special was that? This is the Sea of Galilee, okay? So it's a sea, but it's not a sea, right? Jesus and his disciples withdrew to the sea. Now, again, withdrawing to the sea means walking from the Capernaum synagogue about, 100 steps. Capernaum's right basically on the shore. It was a fishing village. So it's not a big deal getting down to the sea from the synagogue, but that's what's happening here. And a great multitude from Galilee followed him from Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and beyond the Jordan, and those from Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude, when they heard how many things he was doing, came to him. So he told his disciples that a small boat should be kept ready for him because of the multitude, lest they should crush him. Can you believe it? For he healed many, so that as many as had afflictions pressed about him to touch him. And the unclean spirits, whenever they saw him, fell down before him and cried out, saying, "You are the Son of God." But he sternly warned them they should not make him known. And he went up on the mountain and called to him those he himself wanted, and they came to him. Okay, here's what's going on here. Huge crowds of people. I mean, is there anybody out there who doesn't need some kind of physical touch? Thank God for doctors, right? And healthcare systems. Where would we be without them? With medications, with antibiotics, whether it's, just a kind of a generic thing or a specific thing, whether it's a disease or whether it's an accident. Most people have need of a physician. Not just once or twice in life, but sometimes many times in life. Sometimes people need a physician almost all the time. People needed a physician. There was no physician like Jesus. I remember an old hymn we used to sing when I was a kid, "The great physician now is here, the sympathizing Jesus." They weren't there because they had any love for him or because they had any theological predisposition. They were there because they were sick and they needed to be healed. And when Mark describes all the places they came from, I mean, let me just comment on that. They were coming from Lebanon. Now, Lebanon from Capernaum is uphill the whole way. In Capernaum, you're in what's called the Lower Galilee. You've got to climb a height, and as you do so, off to the right is a mountain that's called the Mount of Beatitudes, where Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount. And you carry on, and I've driven it hundreds of times over the course of my time when I lived in Israel, because every week I would go up, right past the Sea of Galilee, right past the Mount of Beatitudes, up to the Upper Galilee, all the way into Lebanon to broadcast with a radio station there that was broadcasting the gospel to a war zone. And I'd be there with my trusty Kalashnikov that the Israeli army insisted I have because they couldn't defend me if I needed it. That's a story in itself. But me and my little Volkswagen, I've been there so many times, I've lost count. Anyway, the point being that to get from southern Lebanon down to Capernaum, and in those days people walked, they didn't have cars, would be a very arduous downhill walk. And depending on age, might take anywhere from 2 to 3 days. So they're coming from Lebanon. They're also coming from Syria. Now, Syria is not the Syria we know today, although it includes the Syria we know today. But Syria was a province of Rome. It was sort of on the northeast quadrant of the Upper Galilee. It covered a very, very huge area. It went up along the Mediterranean coast finally, and all the way up into what would be modern-day Turkey. Upper and Lower Galilee, of course, Jerusalem, Judea. These people walked, sometimes days, to get to him. That's how popular he had become. And it was such a crowd that Jesus was afraid he'd get crushed. Now, there are a few other instances in the Gospels where we read about the crowd trampling one another. There's one case, we'll get to it eventually in our studies, where the estimate is there were 50,000 people there. I mean, we've all seen footage of soccer stadiums that go into a panic and people get crushed in the melee that follows some dispute over a goal that wasn't allowed or some decision the referee has made. Well, it's a similar dynamic here. Jesus was afraid of being crushed. So what he had asked his disciples to do, because they were fishermen, get one of your boats just offshore a bit, and I'll go out and I'll sit in the boat. And that way I can, escape the crowd, but I can still teach them. Because Jesus didn't just want to heal, he wanted to teach. And he did both, all right? So he had a reputation as a healer, but he also had a reputation as a teacher. In our terms today, we'd call him a rock star. I mean, he was the story. There was nobody like him in that entire region, right? Interesting, he was healing people, but he was also delivering people from unclean spirits. And in verse 11, the unclean spirits, whenever they saw him, fell down before him and cried out, saying, "You are the Son of God." I find this absolutely fascinating. There's always arguments out there. People say, "I don't believe in God. God doesn't exist. He's just a figment of your imagination. Good for you. It brings you some comfort being religious, but I'm superior to you. I don't need that crutch." They don't need that crutch until they get sick. They don't need that crutch until suddenly there's an accident on the highway and their life is threatened. Suddenly they're crying out to God. I've seen it myself in car accidents. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," from people who have never uttered those words before. I won't go there. The point being this: these unclean spirits knew exactly who Jesus was. No, there's no atheism in hell. No atheism on the part of the fallen angels who are now under the sway of Satan. They know who Jesus is. They live in the spirit realm. And Jesus absolutely terrified them because they knew that he was the Son of God. And he had total power, not over just the world, but over them. Satan's already defeated on the cross, as we'll see in Mark and the other Gospels. They were terrified. Just one word from Jesus, they would have to leave the person they had possessed. If he chose to, he could send them back into the very bowels of hell. and they feared that the most. This is why when he healed the demoniac across the lake in the Golan Heights, they said, let us go into the pigs. They didn't want to go back to their master. Let's go to the pigs. Isn't it fascinating that the very first to confess who Jesus was were the very voices of darkness itself? Which is very instructive. We talk about the existence of God. Sometimes we need to talk about the existence of evil. There is evil in the world. Boy, do we know it. We start from there, we end up discovering there's a God of love.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
My wife Kathy and I just came back a few weeks ago from our most recent trip to Africa, where we're required by law to monitor and evaluate what's happening on the ground with the donor dollars that you provide, because both the IRS in the US and the CRA in Canada require that. And so it's a part of our fiduciary responsibility, if you will, to do that, plus our ministry responsibility. We want to visit orphans and widows and see that our huge team of volunteers, all local church-based, are doing their work, which they are, bless their hearts. And we get involved in home-based care. We visit the sick, the oppressed. Breaks our heart every time. We've been doing it for 20 years. I still can't get used to it. But remember to support WOW while you're working for orphans and widows. And when you support WOW, when you support JCT, we're one and the same. We are the voice of WOW. When you do, ask for Cantelon's Casual Commentary. If you already have Matthew, ask for Mark. Volume 2 of Mark is coming out real soon. See you next time.